All right, welcome everyone. Glad to have everybody here this afternoon. So today we're going to be talking about beginning genealogy research. So my name is Jessica Harrington. I'm the librarian here in the research room at KDLA. So we also got Kim Usry in the chat. She's also going to be moderating, kind of watching the chat. So if you have any technical difficulties or any questions, just kind of pop those in there. We'll get to them. I'll stop periodically, so if we have any questions, we can do that, or we can just wait to the end and have questions then. So kind of up to you guys. We're going to be going for I've got an hour and a half for this schedule, just because I think it's going to be longer than an hour, but it may not be the full hour and 30, so we'll kind of see how that goes. Like I said, if you have any questions or any problems, just use the chat. There's going to be a slide PDF that is available in the Blackboard Learn window, so you're more than welcome to download that if you'd like. This webinar is being recorded, and it should be available within the week on the portal for people to watch later on. Captioning is available, so they should be available two ways. You can click the yes at the top of your screen to see the captions here in Collaborate, or you can use the stream text link, which we should be putting in the chat, to see them in a separate window if you want to do it that way. So captioning is available for anybody who needs it. Did we get the link in there? I don't remember if I copied it or... Oh, there it is. Kim's got it. Okay, so let's just get started. Okay, so for people who come in wanting to do genealogy research, they're all mostly just trying to answer one question, which is kind of just, where did we come from? So they want to know family history. Where did their families come from? Who are their family? Different relatives. What did they do for work? Where did they live? What was their lives like? So sometimes they have a lot of questions that we may not always be able to answer, but sometimes we can help them find some information that kind of gives them an idea of where they're going to get started. So for this presentation, we're kind of going to cover, in the first part, we're going to talk about just the research process in general. And then I'm going to kind of get more specific on different types of records that you're going to be looking at when people are coming in to do genealogy research. So when people are doing genealogy research, there's going to be a couple of different types of things you're going to come across as you're doing the research. So the first is going to be like the family trees and the family charts. These are just the bare bones framework of the who's related to who and who got married when, and like direct family trees, lineages, things like that. These are usually filled out as the researcher goes with the information they gather. So they kind of start adding branches to their family tree. They start adding relatives, relationships, and kind of building as they go. So this tends to be very specific to the actual genealogist. And sometimes they can use, you may come across some that other genealogists or researchers have done. And so you always got to take these, if you do have copies of some of these, you want to take these with a grain of salt, because they're very much based on records or information that the researcher that created it fills out. They're not like original records. These are just things that people are using for their own organization purposes. Then you're also going to have things like family histories. These tend to be more fleshed out. These give more life to more than just the skeleton of the family tree. So these are going to be like the stories that people have passed down, memories that people have, why somebody moved somewhere, why some event happened, divorces, marriages, all the skeletons in the closets per se. These are the family histories that kind of just make everything more colorful, rather than just when did somebody born, when did they get married, when did they die, what kids do they have. So it's much more entertaining, at least. But again, with these, just like any kind of hearsay, there may be grains of truth in there that can help, especially for research, but you don't always want to guarantee these as fact. It's hard to prove some of these, but sometimes they may be the best sources of information you have, especially if you're trying to find information where you're not sure where to start. And then the final one you're going to come across, these are going to be the original records. These are going to be the things that were written down at the time. So when they had a baby born and they wrote down so and so was born and the date in their family Bible, that would be an original record. So these are the things that can actually be used to prove information. Um, a lot of the things we have here at KDLA would be considered the original records because they were actually certified or filed with the government. So that's why we have a lot of the original records here at KDLA. And people come to us, especially for legal stuff or certifications of records. They would request them from us. But this is helping to prove information. So, and don't get me wrong, there's still some things that can be incorrect on original records because sometimes they're based on information provided at the time, which if it was provided and by somebody who wasn't entirely sure, it's not always exactly correct. So the census is always a good example of this because the census taker sometimes just wrote down what they heard when somebody said something. So spellings of names can be awful for the census records, especially because they heard very different things based on um, how they were interviewing the people in the household. All right, so like I said, there are some myths and misconceptions that some genealogists might walk in your door with. It's not going to be quick or easy. Some people think that they could walk in and you're going to be able to type into a computer and Google knows everything. We really wish it did. Family lore, again, is not fact. So just because your Auntie M told you that, you know, so and so had a big fight and ran away to get married to somebody, doesn't always mean that's the truth. So you got to always kind of find some records to back it up at least a little bit. Again, not everything is online. A lot of the records we have here, even at KDLA, we have about 70,000 rolls of microfilm here. And that's just a small fraction of what we would even have as original records. A lot of our original records are not available anywhere else but here. They're still in paper form. So I have a picture of that later that you all can see. And again, records are not immortal. So just because it existed back in the day does not mean it's always going to exist. Sometimes there's disasters, courthouse fires, things can be lost, things can be stolen, unfortunately. That does happen sometimes, especially back in the day when we weren't so good about records management. People took things because they thought they were interesting. Or it got buried in somebody's attic somewhere and then got thrown away when the house was sold. You never really know. So, so there's always some things you gotta kind of want to manage expectations when people first start out with not knowing anything. But so the essentials you really do need when you start for doing any just kind of genealogy research is first you really want some skills. So you got to know where you're looking, what you're looking for, and how to look for it. So that's kind of what we're going to cover today. So the research strategies and kind of the records you're going to be looking into. And then the other things you're going to want is going to be have to be persistent. You got to keep trying because you never know when you're going to find more things. Always be checking new places, new people, do different searches, check for other family members, check other institutions. It's going to be a long process and they may not be able to do all of it at one location. So going to have to put some legwork in sometimes. And then sometimes just getting lucky. So some of that one crucial piece of information that somebody's looking for, it might be buried in somebody's attic and didn't get found until recently, or it's misfiled in a box somewhere, or somebody else found it. So sometimes you just got to get lucky and you got to know who to talk to. But the first part you can work on, the second part you just got to work at, and then the third part, just cross your fingers. So the first steps for any genealogist or researcher wanting to do family research, whether it's yourself or somebody that you're helping who's walked into your library. So the first thing that you want to make sure that they either have done or are ready to do is they need to know what they already have. So to actually start at home, gather any family sources they have, the stories, the documents, the photos, anything they have that they have already themselves. It's kind of surprising sometimes what people have stashed away in boxes that give more information if they were looking at it for their research. And then to also talk to their family, talk to the relatives, talk to the oldest person in their family reunion, anybody who might know more information. Look for other people who have done genealogy research in the family. Sometimes they have actual additional documents or have already done some of the research. Different family members would probably have different kinds of photos. So lots of times you just want to talk to people within the family, even if it's like 3 cousins twice removed. Sometimes there's people who have done a lot of work that might actually simplify the process just a little bit. And then to always start with charting their own family tree themselves. So usually I recommend that they start with themselves and work backwards, because you know most about yourself. You probably know more about your parents, and then you probably know even less about your grandparents. And then the further you go back, the less information you're going to know. But you could start with yourself because you know the most about your own life. So you'll kind of get an idea of what you can prove for yourself, and then you can kind of start proving those kinds of information for your parents, and then branching out from there. Same for, siblings or cousins and things like that. The further you go, the more information you're going to have to do actual research for. So when you're actually doing research, so it's always very important to know specific information that they're looking for. So if they're wanting to prove somebody's birth, be very aware of that's the information you're looking for, and try not to get distracted by side information that you found. And don't get me wrong, this could be very helpful, especially if you're just browsing. But if you're looking for something very specific and wanting to prove something very specific, try to keep focused on that. And then always have the known facts ready so that you can reference those. So additional information can really help sometimes. Whenever you're trying to prove, for example, a relationship between parents and child, some people don't realize that you could actually try and find the marriage record of the child, because sometimes it lists the parents' names on them. And that's not really something you would think of immediately when you're doing the research for a parent-child relationship, especially when you're not trying to connect. You're thinking once after they got married, it's not really connected to their parents much, but it kind of is sometimes. And then always have kind of a working hypothesis, like what do you think is likely to have happened here, but also be aware that it may not be correct. It's still a hypothesis. So you think they got married in this one county, but maybe they actually got married in the next county because it was actually closer to their house. But you won't actually know that until you start looking for the records. And then once you've kind of got your working hypothesis on where you're going to start and where you think things are likely, then you can start identifying what types of records you're going to be looking at that are going to have that kind of information in them. You're looking for likely repositories, institutions, libraries, archives that would have these types of records. And then you also want to kind of keep an eye, remember that there are some online resources that might have information you're looking for in them. So having those available, knowing where to search for some of those things can be very helpful. And if you just have like a list of those, you can kind of check them off and be like, okay, I've checked these. I haven't checked these yet. So kind of working your way through a list, trying to prove something can help. So very focused in knowing what you're looking for can help, because you're not searching everything. You're just searching the things that would be relevant. And then again, plan out your steps. So always start with most likely. So if you're looking for a birth, you probably want to start looking for births. But if you're trying to prove parentage, if you can't find the birth, then you're going to start wanting to work on things that are less likely to have that information, but possible. So if you can't find a birth record, maybe you go in looking for a census record. If you can't find them on the census, maybe you're going to start looking for their marriage record. And if you can't find that, maybe you start looking for their death record, because sometimes that actually does list information about the parents. If not their names, then sometimes it tells where they were born, things like that. So, there's other ways of going about getting information. But if you start planning out your steps, you won't get lost along the way, hopefully. Okay, so key to remember, make sure you keep detailed notes of any searches, even the ones that are unsuccessful, because that means you're not going back and repeating things 5 years later because you forgot you did them. Document everything, so make sure you photocopy any records you do find and keep handwritten notes if necessary. So especially the records that you find, you're going to want to make sure you cite and make sure you know where you found them. So if you ever, for some reason, need to go back and find them again, you know exactly how to access those. So books and page numbers, which institution you were at, if it's on microfilm, if you can write down a roll number, things like that. Definitely know where your information came from, because there's so many times we get requests for people who were looking for something 20 years ago and then have lost that particular copy and need to find it again and are having problems. And again, just stay organized. So keep all of the information easy to access. Make sure you know, so you don't get different cousins with the same name mixed up. So keeping things together, actually organizing things together by the person that they're related to, very important for any kind of researcher, for sure. Okay, so any questions just in general on the basics of just the research? I'll kind of give everybody just a second if they have any questions. Otherwise, we'll just keep on going, and we're going to talk about just the types of records, which is going to get extensive a little bit. All right, yeah, I'm not seeing anybody typing at the moment. So, all right, so moving on into different types of records, and I'm going to cover all of these at least in brief. There's more detail that I could go into for all of these, but just kind of giving a general overview of them so you kind of know vaguely what they're going to be including. If you have any more questions, my contact information is at the end. If you have specific questions or that you don't get to during this particular session. But otherwise, just wait to the end and let me know. All right, so different types of records, they can vary. So the first ones we're going to kind of cover are going to be government related. Things we're going to likely have here at KDLA. Sometimes you might have them in your own library. And then we're going to talk about more things that are going to be, they're not government specifically, they're going to be, but they're more likely to be things you might have at your library. So, okay, so first up is going to be vital records. So these are the births, the marriages, and the deaths. So things like birth certificates, birth registers, marriage certificates, marriage bonds, marriage books, the death. There's going to be death certificate, there's death registers, um, things like that. So this is kind of like a list of some of the information you're likely to find in each type of these records. So for births, you're likely to find the name, the race, the birthplace, the birth date, and the parents' names and birthplaces. For marriages, you're likely to find the names and ages of the brides and grooms, the marriage date and location, as well as the parents' names and permissions sometimes, especially if they were younger when they got married, and much further back in time. This again does vary depending on the county and the time period, as well as what was actually written down. Sometimes they just didn't fill out the form completely, so it wasn't really necessarily a requirement per se. And then the deaths, you're likely to have their name, their race, their birth and death date, so that you know how old they were when they died, location of their birth and the location of the death, cause of death, burial information, such as like the cemetery they probably or were buried in, marital status if they were widowed, and possibly even the spouse's name. So sometimes it does include other information if the form included the spaces for them. Sometimes it will list like birthplaces of the parents or the parents' names. It very much kind of depends at the time period on the certificate form that they were using at the time. So here's an example of like a marriage record. I think this one is from Boyle County. Yeah, Boyle County, 1924. So in general, Boyle County, so this one's kind of a little bit rough to read. You can see it's handwritten. So some of the writing of the names is can be a little tricky. but it is possible sometimes just to read them. This is where that cursive handwriting comes in handy sometimes. And then sometimes I'm just like, I don't think this makes any sense. So there's marriages. Marriage records are going to be actually the easiest ones to search sometimes. And that's because they actually exist for most counties since the founding of the county. The microfilm we have here at KDLA, we do have microfilm copies for most counties, but there are a couple of county clerks who have kept their own records and we don't even have copies of. It's very much a county by county basis. But in general, we do have most of them here. Sometimes you might have these kinds of marriage records at your library if you have them on microfilm or something. Otherwise, they might just be at the courthouse, at the county clerk's office, or you might just have indexes sometimes that just refer to those that people could then go and get and do the actual, find the actual certificate themselves. So the reasons, like I said, these are fairly easy to, because they do exist since for most counties since their founding, unless again there was some kind of a disaster or a fire. And then, okay, so for births and deaths, these are a little trickier. So 1852 is when we first started recording births and deaths in the state of Kentucky. So anything before 1852, there don't exist. There's nothing at all, at least not for government records. And then up until 1910, we do have those kinds of records here at KDLA, here on microfilm. But the problem with these is those that in that time frame, the records are not consistent or complete. So we always need to know the county and the year, and then we look and see if there's even any records to search for that time. And then we don't guarantee that there's going to be anybody listed. I would say there's a couple of times whenever we will pull a year for a year of records, and it's like 6 people listed. So at the time, it was very much people, it was a voluntary thing to report a birth or death, and it wasn't really required. And there were actually time periods where they reversed the legislation that was trying to encourage people to do it. So there's entire like spans of time where they didn't do anything writing it down. So very much need to know a county and a year for that time period. So they do exist. They can be searched. Sometimes you can find what you're looking for, but it's not a guarantee. And then after 1911 is when the Office of Vital Statistics was established. So Vital Statistics does have births and deaths for 1911 up into the present. We don't have any of the births after 1911 at all. They still have all of those. And then for deaths, we actually do have copies here at KDLA on microfilm for 1911 to 1965. But we don't have anything after that. So they still actually do have kept those death records at Vital Statistics. We just have copies here on microfilm. So just making sure that people are aware that those do exist. So here's an example of a birth register. You'll notice it's not a certificate like we have these days. Each line of this is a separate individual. Sometimes the child wasn't even named when they did the register of the birth. So a lot of times you're not really, when you're looking for these registers of birth, you're not looking for the name of the child. You're actually looking for the name of the parent, specifically the father. You're more likely to find the name of the father, possibly the mother. You'll notice the mother's column is not always filled out. A lot of blank spaces there. But usually the father is listed specifically. And if you can at least get a child born by the father of the person you're looking for at the date you're thinking about, you've probably found their birth record. It's just may not always have the name of the child listed. So, and then here's a death with the same kind of issues. So you'll see the name of the deceased over here. Sorry, these are so small. They're kind of hard to get an idea of that and still being legible. But usually it lists information. But again, these aren't certificates like we think of today. These are very much a list of people who died. So it's a register of the deaths. And sometimes, like I said, it will list the names of parents on there. On the right-hand side there, it does list some of the parents in some of these cases. But usually it gives more information in the death record than it will in the birth record. Okay, so moving on from the vital records. So let's talk about census records. So a census is just a count and a description of the population. So these have been taken every 10 years since 1790. So this is typically the easiest way to locate a particular ancestor for a researcher, because it is a list based on when the ancestor lived at a particular time. So if you can follow them every 10 years, it kind of checked in, and you can see if they moved from location to location, from county to county, things like that. There were a couple of issues here with the history of their census. 1790 and 1800 have been lost. They were recreated based on tax lists, so people who had paid taxes in that time. But if they didn't own property, they didn't pay taxes, they aren't on the tax list. So the censuses for those times are as complete as can be. But they're not. I can't guarantee that they're everyone who lived in the state at the time. And then 1890, there was actually a fire that destroyed probably the largest percentage of that census. I think the National Archives still has a small amount of them, but it's very little, and I don't think there's anything for Kentucky at all that survived that. So 1890 can be troublesome if you're trying to track somebody through time. This is especially a problem for women because they might be listed in the 1880 census as a child with their parents, but by 1900, which is 20 years later, they're likely already married, and they're probably listed with their husband. And because the census wouldn't list a maiden name, it's really hard to track down women in that 20-year time frame. Even worse is if they were born after 1890 and got married before, they were born after the 1880 census and were married before the 1900 census, which is entirely possible because that's a full 20 years, then they're not on any census at all as a child. So they just completely disappear. It's really can be very tricky. So the most recent census we have is the 1950 census, which was released in 2022. So censuses are released 72 years after the census is taken. This is things to protect against things like identity theft and stuff like that. So there's not a whole lot of personal information that's available that's up to date. So yeah, the 1951 is out as of last year. Technically, we have microfilm of the census records here at KDLA, but if anybody comes in asking, we're probably going to refer them to Ancestry or Family Search because they have better quality scans and they're actually searchable. So you can actually search online for those. So if anybody's looking for census records, if you're going to find it, I would recommend Ancestry and Family Search. They have very, very easy to use search engines, both of them, and you should be able to locate something that way. And you're going to be able to read them much better than you can our film, which is not the greatest quality. So kind of an example of how the census has changed a little over time. So this first one here is for Nicholas County for 1830. So this is a very early census. And at this time period, they didn't list everybody in the household. They only list the name of the head of household. So usually just the husband, or if it was a widow, if she was a head of household, she might be listed. But it's typically just a man's name. And then it would list how many people within that age category were in the household. So that's what all these ones across the page are. It's just one of this particular age, one of this particular age, things like that. So you're not going to be able to find children's names in the early censuses because it was just heads of household. And then as time went on, they kind of got a little more complicated. So the one on the left is Nicholas County in 1870 census. which you'll see has several names listed, and it gives more information a little bit on the page for them. And then the one on the right is the 1940 census for Nicholas County as well. So even in just that time, between those three, you can see a lot of information is being added to the census. They ask more detailed questions. They keep track of more information. So the more recent the census record, the more details you're probably going to find on it, just in general. So some of the oldest censuses are not going to have a great deal of information. Okay, so just in general, here's what you're going to find on the censuses. So names, ages, and birthplaces, you're probably going to find on all of them. 1850 to 1950, you're going to find the names for all of the people in the household. Prior to that, it was just the head of household with the names. So 1880 to 1950, you're going to have the birthplaces of the parents of the person on the census. In 1880 is when they started asking what the relationship that was to the head of household. You should be able to find family and neighbors on the same census page for all of the years. So census taker went door to door. So if they're on the same page, they were probably neighbors. And people didn't move very far from their family, so it's likely that they were probably even related to their neighbors. So family and neighbors you should be able to find for most census records. There was a short time period they were asking for immigration information. So 1900 to 1930, they were asking when they immigrated to the U.S. or if they were born here. The same thing for citizenship. 1910 to 1940, they were asking if they were U.S. citizens on the census. So sometimes you can get some interesting information for people who came in and immigrated to the U.S. on the census information there. Okay, so land records. So when we talk about land records, there's really kind of two types we kind of focus on. The first is the deeds, and these are the most common. So this is a record that is created each time property is transferred or sold. So some people have this idea that deeds perpetuate and continue, and you can just search and you'll see what properties in somebody's name. It's not really that easy. To actually locate a deed, you need to know when the actual land was purchased or sold, because that's when the actual recording of the document was done. But for deeds, it's actually pretty good to search those because they do exist for most counties since they were founded. And these are recorded in the county clerk for the county where the land was located. The thing to remember, though, is because Kentucky went from one county of Virginia, the Kentucky County, all the way to 120 counties, we've divided up a bit. So the important thing to remember for deeds is as new counties were created or the boundaries of those counties changed, older records of deeds stayed in the parent county they were created in. So just because a particular piece of land now is located in a particular county doesn't mean all of the deeds for that land are located in that county, because maybe that county was subdivided out from a much larger county earlier on in its history. So you may have to check all of the parent counties and neighboring counties sometimes, depending on how the divisions changed over time. And then the oldest kind of land records we have for the state are actually the land grants. So these were issued by the government for military service or as a cash payment. So the Secretary of State, the Land Office, has all of the indexes and original records for the land grants. These are the earliest land records for the state. So these tend to be in the 1700s and the early 1800s. We do have copies for most of these records on microfilm here at KDLA. But if anybody has any specific questions about land grants, we usually actually refer them to the land office because they know a lot of information about these early records. There are some books that have been published about these, like indexes and things you can search. We refer to those a lot as well. But definitely, if you have any questions about land grants specifically, I would recommend the land office for those. Yeah, especially the early stuff. These deeds they're handwritten, so they can be hard to read, and they get a little interesting on what they use for boundaries sometimes. Because sometimes it'll be that the corner of the property started with 3 oak trees on a hill. So, or how to connect those properties. Did we lose the connection or something? No, maybe not. Okay. So, but the early ones are going to be handwritten. So I think this example here is an 1808 deed from Casey County. So, so again, these earliest records, these were actually handwritten into the book by the clerk. So that was actually the clerk's job, was to take a document and copy it into the deed book for the county as an official record. So that's kind of what these look like here. Let's see. So land records, deeds, and land grants. Okay, so moving on, there's going to be the probate records. So probate is what is going to happen after somebody. Glad everybody's fixing something. So probate records are what happens after someone passed away. So it was the handling of their estate, settling their debts, making sure it passed on inheritances correctly, things like that. The problem is for probate records for Kentucky is we didn't actually have a probate case file like we do today. That didn't start until 1978, which is very late as far as trying to locate these records. So when looking for probate records, you're actually going to have to search multiple books. You're going to search multiple types of records. It can be a bit of a tricky situation sometimes, but usually the best places to start are the will books. Those tend to, if they have a will, it's going to be in there. If they don't have a will, sometimes it has other estate settlement papers in there, like the inventories or the appraisements of the estate. Sometimes there's guardianships. Sometimes if the settlement was contested, there's court cases. Otherwise, it went through the county court, so you might check the order books. There's a whole bunch of different types of books that are related to probate stuff. And unfortunately, they're not really collected into a single file until they redid the entire court system in 1970s. So if you're looking for old wills and stuff, it can be a bit of a process. Here's kind of a newer example of a book. This is a will book from Whitley County in 1927. So in later records, some of them are actually typed, which makes reading them much easier. So yeah, this is an example that's kind of later on in our state. So you can kind of see how the clerk would type things into the book, and you would have the copies and then they would sign it. So it's a little interesting to see the differences between this particular will book versus the earliest of the deed books. So you can get some interesting differences in how the clerk handled those books at the times. Okay, and then moving on, there's going to be the tax records. So tax records are things like the tax lists. These are usually actually for researchers, and specifically, these are going to be kind of very similar to the census with the same kinds of information, because it usually lists the name of the person paying the taxes, how much property they owned, and things like that. So at least you can track the head of household, the family, through the tax list, and it's taken just about every year. So 10 years for a census is a pretty long range. The tax lists are usually every year. So it's much easier to track a family, and you can kind of tell if they bought or sold property in between. You can kind of know if they're moving around a bit. These are also good if, for example, like the 1890 census is missing, you might be able to use the tax list to kind of track them through the county or the state, multiple counties. If you are knowing where they're moving from and are pretty sure of your guesses, you can kind of use them as an alternative to the census. But typically they asked if they had property, if they volunteered in the militia. There's a couple of different things that they're going to ask on the tax list. They're usually interesting. Early on in our state history, there was also the poll tax. So this was paid every year by white males aged 21 and up for the privilege of voting. So voting was very much considered a privilege. It was not something you were guaranteed, and you had to pay a tax for it. So polling itself was taxed, and then again, you also paid taxes on any property you owned. So at the bare minimum, if it was a white male over 21, they're probably on the tax list because they would have had to have paid their poll tax in order to vote. So usually they paid all their taxes on the same day they went to do the voting. So, it is what it is. Okay, so then we're going to start getting to things that I know a little bit less about, but I'll do my best. So there's the military records. So these are the records for people who had military service. So there's the compiled service records, which are going to include things like the muster rolls, the pay vouchers. It's going to have like the rank and unit, dates of service, basic information about where they were born, where they came from, how old they were. It might have some medical information in there. So the compiled service records are pretty interesting. There is the adjunct general reports, which is kind of like a summary of the different troops and their units and movements, and any notes from the adjunct general are all collected into they're published in books, and you can kind of see how a particular unit, if there's any notes from the adjunct general in those. The thing to remember though for the adjunct general reports is for some of the records, for some of the wars, they're the only record available anymore. Because in the 1800s, they didn't have the same record management priorities that we have these days. So in the early 1800s, they actually destroyed a lot of military records because they thought they had to make room for the new ones. So some of our early wars, we don't have any actual extensive military records on. We just have the adjunct general reports. So sometimes those are the only resources we have for those. There's also things for pension records. So pension records include things like the pension applications. So veterans would apply for their pension, or their widows or heirs. And when they applied for these pensions, they would actually have to include supporting documents to prove their service or to prove the relationship to the veteran. So the pension records, the pension applications are actually pretty interesting. We do have some of them here. So those are interesting to look at sometimes. No, I think I said that wrong. We don't have really necessarily all the pension information here. We have a bonus application here that's kind of related to that. I have the contact information for the Department of Military Affairs in our next page here that I'll talk about in a second. And there's also things like the bounty land records, which is when they were, again, given land in a right to a particular amount of land based on their military service. So that's where those land grants come in. They're pretty important. They can prove military service sometimes because they'll actually tell why they were granted the land properties. And again, we have some records here at KDLA, but not extensively. So if you're looking for military records, the best ones are actually going to be the Department of Military Affairs. I put their contact information there, and their phone number. They're going to have most of the existing records for Kentuckians who served. They're going to have those probably there. or at least they should be your first call. In general, the National Archives is going to have any records for the Revolutionary War up through 1912 at Washington, D.C. And then the National Personnel Records Center, which is in St. Louis, will have service records from World War I up to the present day. So those are the key locations for military records. Those were the institutions you're probably going to want to refer people to. Okay, and then there's the court records. So these are, think of these like not just court cases, but any kind of legal activities that people would have gone through throughout their life. So this can be anything from divorce proceedings to civil disputes where they're suing each other, or even criminal charges if they're being accused of crimes or, end up sentenced to prison for something. But these can provide more information than just what happened. Sometimes they can include relationships. They can include information about a person's character, how people perceived them. It can include financial and business information, especially if like they're suing each other for money or property or something. It can give information about their business and relationships and things like that. Or if they even held a court position themselves. Maybe they weren't accused of a crime. Maybe they were a lawyer or a clerk or something. Sometimes you'll find them in records like that pretty commonly. The problem with court records, though, is most of these records are still in original form. They're not on microfilm. They're not digitized. And so they're harder to get access to sometimes because they're only physically really here. Or they're still at the county themselves who have kept them. So kind of here's an example of a box of case files. And you can see it's literally just pieces of paper grouped together, tied together still, fragments of paper. On the right-hand side, there's actually a deposition for a divorce, from a divorce case from 1880. So I think this one gives... Yeah, it's looking like they're trying to sue for divorce, and it's telling how long they were aware they knew the couple. It says something about his wife abandoned him over a year ago. So it's kind of interesting to read some of these depositions and witness statements sometimes. So they can have some really good information. They're just really hard to access sometimes because you have to be able to, know what you're looking for. So we have a lot of people who come in doing research into court documents, and that's just because we're the only place they can come for them. That's the only place they exist. All right, so there's also immigration and naturalization records. So before 1790, there were no federal laws for immigration or naturalization. So in this case, Virginia laws applied to Kentucky. So in 1779, Virginia would grant citizenship to any white individual born in the territory and living there for more than 2 years. So they didn't have to do anything special. They just became a citizen if they were white and born there or lived there for more than 2 years. They just became a citizen. Nothing special had to happen. But in 1783, they decided that they had to appear before a court to become a citizen. So they had to go before a judge and prove they had been there for 2 years or that they had, things like that. So that in order to actually attain citizenship. So in 1790 to 1906, there was a Federal Naturalization Act. So immigrants into the country became eligible to naturalize as a citizen after 5 years. And this process could be handled in any court. So a city court, a county court, a state court, a federal court, it did not matter. Any court could naturalize somebody as a citizen. This means it's really hard to find sometimes because it doesn't even guarantee that it's a court near where they lived. So they could have gone 3 counties over, 2 states over, and applied in front of the court and still become a citizen. So just because somebody has an immigrant ancestor who was naturalized in that time period, it can be a little tricky sometimes to still find the actual record of it, just because any court could do it as long as they had a seal. So that basically that was the only thing that was required. In 1906, the federal naturalization process was actually established. So early on, these naturalizations could still happen in a non-federal court, but the documentation of it must be submitted to the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization. And then by 1940, up until the present day, only federal district courts can grant citizenship. So the only way to become a citizen is to go through the federal district court. So if you're looking for immigration and naturalization stuff, it's very important to know when you believe that the naturalization happened, because it will inform your search on which kind of court you're actually looking for. So if you know it happened after 1940, you know there'll have to be a federal record. If it was before that, it might be a federal, it might be state, it could be any court at all, but at least you know it's not just one particular one. Okay, so there are a couple things to remember though about naturalization. Is not all immigrants actually did the full citizenship process. Sometimes they applied and never actually finished out the process. Sometimes they never applied at all. Sometimes, and then let their children be naturally born here in the U.S. and be citizens themselves, but they never actually went through the process as the parents didn't. So the other thing to remember is men are the primary applicants for most early records. And that's because the children inherited the citizenship of the father at the time. And women actually received citizenship from their husband, even if they were U.S. citizens already. So if a woman who had always lived in the U.S., was born here, lived here, and got married to an immigrant who wasn't naturalized, she actually gained his citizenship for his country. So even without ever leaving the state, without ever leaving the country, she would become a citizen of another country entirely because of her husband. It wasn't until 1922 that the Married Women's Act actually granted women a nationality of their own, independent of their husband. So, and there actually was a time period where women who had lost their citizenship because they had married someone who had immigrated had to actually apply back for their own citizenship. So it's a little interesting sometimes to actually see that. All right, so now we're kind of going to be getting into more information that you're probably going to have more locally in your libraries than we're going to have here at KDLA, because we focus on government records specifically, and we're going to start talking about things that aren't necessarily government records. So, for example, there's cemetery records. So sometimes these are going to be just the headstone inscription. It's just a list of everybody who was buried in a particular cemetery. Sometimes people have gone around and just read those and written them down and created lists of people. Sometimes it just kind of depends on the record itself, how it was collected, the information was, when it was written down, things like that. So sometimes they were recorded by cemetery officials and caretakers, or it was a volunteer of the community who went around and did themselves. It kind of just depends. So depending on how it was gathered or who wrote it down or when it was collected, it can give various pieces of amounts of information. But usually you're going to find the name, birth and death dates. Sometimes you can find related people, especially if they were buried next to each other, like their spouse. If they had military service, sometimes there's engravings or emblems or something on the tombstones themselves. Sometimes you can see their religion, possibly their occupation. If they were married, obviously if they were buried next to their spouse, you're probably going to see marriage information. Possibly a maiden name, exactly for a woman. You might have that information on their tombstone. And then there's also going to be some other kinds of church records. There's going to be like baptisms. Churches sometimes kept their own records of marriages. So by the priest or the preacher themselves, they might have their own registers and books. They kept track of marriages that they had done. It's not the same as the government record that was issued, registering it with the county clerk, but it's something that could actually help if you're looking for a particular kind of marriage and you know exactly which church they got married at. Um, Also, burial information, especially if the priest or the preacher presided over the funeral. Like I said, these are especially helpful if you can't find the official record. This might give you more information about why you can't find the official record. Sometimes just because the location of the marriage happened in a particular place does not mean that's where the actual documentation was filed. Um, the most interesting one we have found, there was a marriage record I came across where the bride and groom lived in the center of Ohio. The groom was born in the center of Ohio. The bride's family was from Madison County, and the marriage occurred in Madison County, but the actual certificate of the marriage filed with the county clerk was in Campbell County. So, nowhere near any of those places. Still have no idea how that happened, but it was a very interesting find to find. So, um, be very aware that sometimes locating church records can be helpful, especially if you're not sure why, if you're trying to prove a marriage happened, but you can't find the official record saying it did. Church records can also have things like membership lists. So, if you want to see if somebody was a member of the church, things like that. Church histories can be interesting. But again, the availability of all these different types of records will depend on the denomination of the church, how active was the church, who did the record keeping, was there any disasters, has the church records been lost, is this church still active? It very much kind of depends. Newspapers are pretty helpful. These can have things like obituaries in them. They can also have court notices and reports of court activities. So if somebody is being charged with a crime, they're probably going to be listed in the newspaper. If they're getting a divorce, they might be listed in the newspaper. If they're getting married, they might be getting listed in the newspaper. So any kind of announcements for things like that are helpful in the newspaper as well. If you can narrow down a time frame, you can probably find some information in there. And they can add a little more, sometimes even more explanation to something going on that you found an official record for, but don't have an explanation for anything strange in it. Sometimes the newspapers can make it make sense a little because they can explain what the situation is. Other things that in the newspaper, things like community involvement. So if they got an award or were involved in a particular group or, the society pages of some sort, newspapers can be pretty good for that. So exploring around in those can sometimes find some interesting information based on the time period that you're looking, the location area for the family you're looking for. This is especially true if they had any amount of like money and would be considered wealthy of any type. They're more likely to be in the newspaper for sure. Um, okay, so there are other types of records. I can't really go through all of them. The important thing to know here is that you really need to know what is in your library's collection. Because you're probably going to have things in your Kentucky room, in your files that nobody else has, and or you're going to have things in there that if you don't know that they exist, it might be hard to even locate them. And so anybody walking into your library may not know to even look at these or how valuable they are for just any kind of search if you don't point them out to them. So you might have family records in there. You might have researcher files. I've heard them called family files. I've heard them called surname files. Just the collection of researcher information that might have been donated to your library, collected by like a last name. Um, those are pretty useful sometimes. You're probably going to have local history books. So a lot of people might visit looking for information about your county, local information. things like that. You might have oral histories. These can be very good and very interesting to listen to sometimes. It kind of really gives a voice to people who lived further back in time and knew or remembered things from even further back. So it's kind of really interesting to listen to some of these oral histories. You could have historical maps. People really love maps. They love looking at things and trying to find current locations on historical maps and making connections like that. It's really, people really love to do that. So yeah, just the key thing is to know is you always want to make sure that even if you can't find the information that somebody is looking for in your library and you're knowing where to send them on, but the most important thing is to know what do you actually have that maybe they couldn't find anywhere else. So there's always like family search and ancestry, which are great for the online resources, but again, not everything is online. So always be prepared to kind of highlight the things that you have that are special that nobody else has. Um, like even the Kentucky Historical Society here, they have collections from different counties, but I would almost guarantee that the local libraries probably have more in their own Kentucky rooms than just the Kentucky Historical Society would have on their own county. So be experts in the county that you're in for sure. Okay, so kind of coming to the end of this here. We do have research guides that we've created here at KDLA. So these are kind of longer explanations of different types of records and topics. So if you're doing specific types of research on things like birth and death records or census records, divorce records, court histories, family records, things like that, we do have some research guides that give more information on how they've changed over time, information that's going to be available, how to access them, things like that. We do have those on our website, and I put the link for our website is on the slide. Otherwise, you can just go to our website, and it's at the top under Archives and Reference, and it's called Resources for Researchers. And you should be able to find the research guides there. They're pretty handy, especially just as a handout, or if you're looking for more detailed information or additional resources to go to if you're looking for a particular type of search. And then I like to suggest this particular book. I know a lot of libraries probably have it in their collection. It's an older book, but it's very much still very useful. So it's Kentucky Ancestry, A Guide to Genealogical and Historical Research. And this is a very, very handy guide. It's going to break down everything by type of record. It's not going to have so much help as far as a lot of the digital resources that we now have these days, but it should explain a lot about the different types of records and where to find some of them and why they're organized the way they are. So it can be very, very helpful for sure. Okay, so final reminders here. Just remember that research is a lot of time, a lot of patience, and a little bit of luck. And that to always remember that resources are not always going to be easy to access, especially if you're just in one location. So genealogists are probably going to have to travel to multiple libraries, multiple archives. They may have to contact a lot of different places trying to find a specific type of record if they can't find it in one location. Unfortunately, sometimes this information may not even always be found because, again, there could be disaster or it could have gotten lost. It could have been filed away somewhere by mistake in the wrong place, and now nobody knows where it's at. It's entirely possible. There's a lot of reasons why you may not find it. It may just not be found yet. But it's always just a puzzle. And there's lots of pieces. Sometimes you can see the big picture, even if you don't have all the pieces. So just kind of keep it going. It's very much something you have to keep working on. And it's always just know when to refer somebody to another institution or who to send them to if they're looking for something very specific that you can't help them with. And that's why I gave some of the examples of other places in this presentation. So kind of finishing off here, anybody has any questions, you can start putting those in chat or, just letting us know. And then I put my email address on here. So if you have any questions, like very specific ones or issues you want to talk to, we're more than welcome to contact me. Or you can always just call the KDLA research room here, and you can talk to any of our staff. We can all answer those kinds of questions here. So those are really great. So giving everybody some time, see if anybody has any questions. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'm not really seeing a whole lot of people. Um, well, if like I said, my email's there. Or you can just call it KDLA. We're more than welcome to answer the questions. Do you want to thank the Institute for the Museum and Library Services? Just because they are providing our funding and sponsoring the webinar. So definitely make sure you fill out the survey at the end here. It's going to be very important to help with our continued federal funding here. Just as a quick reminder, this webinar is recorded and should be available within the week. And slides are available if you want to download those. We should be putting in the survey link should be in there, and you should get a certificate of attendance in your learner dashboard within the week. So, and thank you for Kim for doing the moderation in here, especially with just some technical difficulties here at the beginning. Yep, there's that survey. Oh, I see the question. I missed that. Hang on. Do you all have a policy at library level on how in depth you help people with research? Here at KDLA, it's a little bit different because we charge for requests for records, and because all of our records are on most of our records are on microfilm. If we can't find it based on like a computer search with just general basic information, it's considered a research request, and we charge them for the work. So if we would have to go pull microfilm to look up a name, it needs to be a research request. So there is a charge for that they have to actually pay. So we have like forms that people fill out and submit that with a payment. And then especially if we have to go pull original documents, those would be considered a research request. So that's kind of where that comes from. Not really sure how that's going to work so well with a public library, though. Hope that helped a little. All right. Thank you guys. I'm going to stop the recording, and I hope to see you all sometime in the future. Just let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.